So we're going to start today by talking about bleeding Kansas. And I brought this up right before class when there were only a couple of us here. Have y'all ever heard this term, bleeding Kansas? Do you know what it is we're going to actually talk about today?
Yeah, this is like an outline point for me.
Oh, okay. So some of you have run into this already in your research talking about Kansas. Okay, well, remember that at this point, we haven't actually added Kansas yet. There still isn't a Kansas. This is where we are right now at this point in our history study. This is what the US looks like right now. It's all of the states in pink are actual states. The Republic of California has been added as, it started off as a country and it was added as a whole state. Texas, same thing, it was added as a state. And all of the rest of this is unorganized territory that still has to follow some rules in order to get organized. So there is no Kansas yet. There's no Kansas, there's no Nebraska, there's no Colorado. A lot of the states that we're familiar with haven't been formed yet. And part of the thing that's holding that up is when they form, what rules do they abide by? How do they form? And the biggest question, of course, is what? What law is it most people are most worried about when new states form?
Are we going to be a free state or a slave state?
Is it going to be a free state or a slave state? And the reason why that matters is because if they're going to be slave states, that means that representatives in Congress are going to come from slave-owning, people, and they'll have a bigger voice the more representatives they have. One of the other big things that people are asking about has to do with railroads. Now, we had a big railroad boom in the 1830s, and all of a sudden we went from no railroads to lots and lots and lots of railroads in the Northeast. You remember how we brought the Irish famine by bringing potatoes to the railroads in the Northeast and then shipping them overseas? Yeah, that's all a big boom that has happened, but the conversation has started, how can we build a railroad that crosses the entire continent? Because we need one of those. How else are we going to have a sea to shining sea country if there's no railroad that goes from one side of the country to the other? The problem is this great big spine of mountains right here, okay? The Rocky Mountains are not something that you can just nudge out of the way. They're kind of substantial. So building a railroad through the Rockies, there are only a couple of places where there's breaks possible to build a railroad through, and they're still going to have to dynamite their way through a lot of the Rockies, even at those breaks. One of those breaks is through the north, one of them is through the Midwest, and one of them is through the South. So wherever the railroad, the transcontinental railroad ends up, the states that it ends up in are going to be the ones with all the economic power. So do we give those to slave states or free states? Do we build the railroad through the South and expand the economy of slavery, or do we build it through the North and expand the economy of the abolitionists? So in Congress, this is a big question. They're like fighting, and when I say they're fighting in Congress, it hasn't happened in my lifetime that Congress has fought the way that congressmen fought during this time, because they're literally throwing punches over these questions. Part of the reason for that is this. This is called the F Street mess. And this is something that actually still happens in Washington today. A lot of the people that work in Washington, congressmen that work in Washington, don't live there. So they take houses or they rent apartments or whatever while they're there. And then they have their homes in whatever state they represent. Well, in a lot of cases, they roommate. The senators roommate together. They rent a house together or they rent an apartment together. And that way they, save money for their state, but they also have all kinds of opportunities to meet. So David Atchison was a representative from Missouri, which is definitely a slave state. It's the state that, broke the Missouri Compromise so that it could be a slave state. And he has a house on F Street that he shares with several other congressmen. And they meet in the kitchen and they make big decisions about how they're going to vote on things in the kitchen. So the group of senators who lives in this house and has meetings in this house is called the F Street mess, as in mess hall, or, I don't know if we have military people here, but, you call it a mess. But it's a group of people that actually meet in the kitchen and make decisions on how they're going to vote. And then they go to work in the Congress and they vote. And they are all slave owners. They're all people who are fighting for the rights of slave owners that live in this house. And they are like a block in Congress that's very hard to get around because they're in the Senate, which has less representatives in it. So the question we're asking is, yes? Sure. Go ahead. It's good because I usually ask a test question about the F Street mess because it's just a funny sounding name and it's good if you can remember what it is. So, yeah, you should. There's almost always a test question on there. Okay. Let me give you like 3 more seconds. You good? Okay. So the question is, as territories get organized in this unorganized territory up here, as we start to fill it up, what rules are we going to use? The Land Ordinance of 1787 says no new slave states at all, okay? But that also only applied to the Northwest Territory, or this territory up here, the Ohio River Valley, okay? When the Missouri Compromise happened, they drew a latitude line and said no slave states above this line, all free states above this line, except that Missouri was already populated by slave owners, so they said except Missouri. Okay, and so this is the Missouri Compromise line. This line is supposed to, was established when this was as far as America went. This section right here, the Louisiana Purchase, all of this belonged to Spain. So does that just extend out west? Or do we have new rules for all of these areas right here? So this bitter fighting has to do with slavery, whether slavery is going to grow, and where the railroads are going to go. What the new states are going to be organized under what law and what's going to happen. So this little guy, who was a pretty little guy, he was like, I think 5'8" or something. He was just like my height. So he was a little guy, but he had a big voice and a lot of power. Stephen Douglas was the Democratic senator from Illinois, which meant that along with most Jacksonian Democrats, he didn't have anything particular against slavery. He didn't own any himself. But he didn't see that overturning the whole institution was the best idea. Most of the Jacksonian Democrats, that's the way they felt. He pushed an idea of a compromise through, and that compromise said that the new states that are going to get formed are going to get formed under something called popular sovereignty. Okay, popular sovereignty means that as you're forming the state, the people who live there get to vote on whether it's a free state or a slave state. So all you have to do is organize a state with a population that agrees with you, and then that population will vote on whether it's going to be a free state or a slave state. That seems fair. Doesn't that seem fair? Can y'all spot the flaw right off the bat?
Yeah, it's like modern. It's like past, or it's like the grandfather to gentrification.
Okay, how so?
Well, because you see it in Texarkana. Everybody during the segregated time moved to Pleasant Grove.
Okay.
And created a white community. So everybody's about to move into Kansas and try and get as many slave owners as possible in Kansas.
Right. If you know in advance that a state is going to use popular sovereignty to decide whether it's going to be a slave state or a free state, and you want it to be one or the other, what are you going to do? Send people there. Yes, that's the absolute smartest thing to do. Round up as many people as possible. The F Street mess agrees to this because they think the Compromise of 1850 will mean that the whole Missouri Compromise gets thrown out. The line across the U.S. that says no free or no slave states above this line, they're pretty sure that if they agree to this compromise, that will get thrown out. And all states will be able, even all the way up north and like what's going to eventually be, you know, the northwestern tip of the U.S. could be a slave state if they get enough people to vote. Because right now, as it stands, the best they can hope for is like Texas and what's west of that. The best they can hope for is what's here, because this is what the Missouri Compromise used. If they can get that thrown out, they can get all of these states could be slave states, and the institution of slavery could spread and spread and spread all the way up into that really fertile, like northern land, which is good because because slavery has to expand to survive, as we discussed before. The president at this time is Franklin Pierce. And have y'all ever heard of Franklin Pierce? You want to know why you've never heard of Franklin Pierce? He's pretty unremarkable for most of his presidency. And one of the reasons for that is because he doesn't like making decisions. So he's facing do I make the Southern plantation owners happy, or do I make the railroad builders happy? Because railroad entrepreneurs want to build in the North. They want to build out of the sort of Western people. So
Pierce doesn't want to make a decision at all. What he wants to do is he wants somebody to drum up a court case so that it can end up in the Supreme Court, so the Supreme Court can rule on whether the Missouri Compromise is constitutional or not. Then maybe they'll throw it out and he won't have to make a decision. That's like Franklin Pierce's whole thing. He doesn't really want to make any decisions. He has Stephen Douglas talking to him though. So Stephen Douglas arranges a meeting with Franklin Pierce and the F Street mess, and they agree to try to get the compromise, the Missouri Compromise, out of the way and make room for the 1850 Compromise, okay? Stephen Douglas makes a deal that says maybe the issue here is the territory is too big. So let's split it into two, because right now, as it stands right now, Nebraska's already mostly populated by people who don't own slaves. It's almost all non-slave owners, whereas Kansas is right on the border of Missouri and just a little bit north of Texas, which definitely has slaves. So, you know, it's possible that Kansas will end up being a slave state, but they're pretty sure the popular sovereignty, Nebraska won't. So let's split this territory into two and create Nebraska and Kansas, okay? That's what they decide to do. One of the things that they have to negotiate is whether or not to make both of them popular sovereignty or make one of them free and one of them slave. Just do it from the beginning. Just say Nebraska will be a free soil state and Kansas will be a slave state, and that will be that. The compromise says popular sovereignty, okay? But abolitionists don't like that because that means that slave owners and the people that support slavery could move into the areas and, like I said, move slavery all the way up into the northern states if they agree to this. The Southerners don't like it because they know that with popular sovereignty, it's always possible. They're gonna lose Nebraska right off the bat. Stephen Douglas basically holds them all hostage. He talks for 5.5 hours about his compromise until they are ready to vote just to shut him up, which they do, and it passes 37-14. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This, yes.
On the last slide, it did say 1954 rather than.
Yeah, that really should be 1854. Good catch. I'll make sure to fix that because we don't need to be confused about that. It should be 1854. Okay, so it passes in the Senate. Now they've got to debate it in the House. Okay, I want to give you a pretty clear picture of what this looked like when they were debating in the House. At one point, an armed Virginia representative had to be restrained and carried out of the House because the fighting got so vicious. Okay, when it did pass, it passed 113 to 100. Okay, so it was an extremely close vote, and the whole time that they were debating it, which it got pushed back and pushed back and pushed back over and over again. It got pushed back to the end of the agenda. When they finally did debate it, it was so violent that they had to actually carry people out. So this was March 4th, 1854 was when it was voted into the Senate. It didn't pass in the House of Representatives until May 30th. That's how long they were debating it, okay, from March to the end of May. But it did pass. So now we've got these two states that are going to decide for themselves whether they're going to be free states or slave states. And two of the loudest voices arguing this point are Senator Douglas and Senator Lincoln. These two guys are both from Illinois. They're both senators from the same place. And they engage in public debate about whether or not to support this law. Lincoln is foursquare against it. He says we should keep the Missouri Compromise line. We should just make these free states and these slave states.
I recognize that name.
You do? Does this guy look familiar?
Yeah, Stephen Douglas. It didn't click.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, the other guy's sort of familiar too, right?
Well, yeah.
Senator Lincoln? Okay, just making sure. I wouldn't want to lose you.
He was very small. Douglas is very small compared to Lincoln.
Yeah, the two of them standing next to each other must have been pretty funny looking. Because they're equal on this playing field now because they're both just, you know, they're busts. But when they were standing right next to each other, it must have been Lincoln. Anyway. How tall was Lincoln? Somebody Google it. How tall was Lincoln? 6'2". 6'2"?
Apparently he used to box too.
I mean, why wouldn't he?
I mean,
Okay, so what we end up doing with Kansas is exactly what we said. If you want the popular sovereignty vote to come out the way you want it to, then you pack it with your people so that they vote on it. So what we end up flooding into Kansas.
Oh, he was 6'4".
He was what?
He was 6'4". I was 2 inches off.
Oh, okay, 6'4". Yeah, well, maybe he had heels on.
I was talking about George Washington. He was 6'2".
Oh, okay. Really?
Yes, he is.
Okay. I'm sorry. I always thought he was short. I don't know why. George Washington was also really tall. Okay. Why do I always think of him as really short? I don't know. Because he's only on that one little coin. That's why. Okay. So Jayhawkers and border ruffians, okay, is who we end up with in Kansas. Border ruffians are people from Missouri who basically creep up into Kansas and then vote themselves. They vote even though they're residents of Missouri, and then they threaten other people who are voting to make sure that they vote that way. They are pro-slavery. The border ruffians are pro-slavery. So they sweep up in from Missouri, from the border of Missouri into Kansas, so that they can. Oh yeah, look, I have text for this. You don't have to remember it. They come into from Missouri. Jayhawkers swoop in from the northern states and move into Kansas as permanent residents, a lot of them. So what ends up happening is that the elections ratifying the Kansas-Nebraska Act, people coming in and voting for the right to have, now they haven't voted on whether or not to be slave states or free states yet. What they're voting on is whether or not they're going to have the right to vote on that, whether or not they're going to be able to decide on it. So of the 1,700 votes, of all of the votes, 1,700 were found to be fraudulent, and only 1,000 were actual registered residents. So most of the people who participated in this vote, like this, in one district, only 20 of the 604 votes cast was found to be valid, actual residents who actually lived there, who actually lived in Kansas. This came up during the 2020 election. Okay, in 2021, between the 2020 and 2021 election, people reminisced about this happening, people just swooping in to, say, for example, Georgia, and voting even though they weren't residents. The problem is, of course, that we have ways of tracking that now that they didn't have then, and so an investigation continuously reveals that that's not what happened in Georgia this time, but they're going to keep investigating, so who knows what we'll find out. But this actually did happen in Kansas. People swooped in from Missouri, voted, and then left, or people moved in from the northern states and set themselves up. One of the reasons for this was the New England Immigration Aid Company, okay? This was in, let's see, if it was Beecher, if it was Henry Ward Beecher, then it's got to have been Massachusetts. Maybe, either Massachusetts or Philadelphia, but I think he was in Massachusetts. It doesn't matter. The point was he was in New England. He was really far away from all of these plantations. So this is a company that basically has organized just for, Brooklyn. Okay.
No, wait. He died in Brooklyn.
Okay. This is a society that formed in New England, one of those New England states, that basically was trying to stamp out slavery by making it not spread. Like we said, it has to spread in order to survive. So if you close it in and only allow it in the states it's already in, and you don't let it spread any further than that, it will die on its own. So there are whole societies that are devoted to making that happen, and this is one of them. They basically pay relocation costs for whole families to move to Kansas as soon as it becomes a possibility that they're going to be able to vote on whether or not they're a free state or a slave state. They provide them with everything that they need to set up shop as a resident of Kansas. Okay, so they move about 2,000 people that way. 2,000 people. Remember the election? They had only 1,000 were actually registered residents. As soon as that's finished, they move about 2,000 people in. Okay, because the Kansas-Nebraska Act has now passed, and now whoever's living there and voting on the Constitution for Kansas is going to be able to vote on whether it's a slave state or a free state. They provide financial assistance, necessary tools, and one of the biggest, most interesting tools that they provide is something called Beecher's Bibles. Anybody want to hazard a guess as what a Beecher's Bible is? Anybody? Well, it came in a big box that said Bibles.
Oh my God, the weapons?
Was it done?
Great big crates that were labeled Bibles that were basically full of guns that Henry Ward Beecher, who's a minister, actually purchased and shipped down into Kansas for the Free Staters to have. The Beecher's Bibles. These were necessary tools of maintaining your sovereignty, I guess. So I love that. Beecher's Bibles. Yeah. Anyway, it didn't matter. They were being shipped from people to people, you know, and those people knew what was coming. It wasn't like they were like, oh, I was hoping this would be a book. They were like, oh, good, they came in, you know. So no, anyway. So the Missouri residents flooded in to vote for pro-slavery officials. They're trying to set up a legislature and they're trying to elect officials. So you have Missouri residents voting for who's going to be the officials who are over Kansas. And then you have the people from the Immigration Aid Society who have actually moved into town who are voting to take who is going to represent them. So 37 of the 39 seats are taken over by pro-slavery representatives because of the Missouri border ruffians, because of people coming in from Missouri to vote. They investigate and they rerun the election, and after that's done, only 29 pro-slavery legislators and 10 anti-slavery legislators remain. This should be legislators, not legislatures. These are people, not organizations, okay? So they had 37 people that won the election to represent, and they were pro-slavery people. But after they reran it and took out all of the people who had come in from Missouri, they only had 29 and 10 who weren't. And the U.S. Congress investigated and realized how corrupt the whole thing had been and threw the whole thing out. Okay? The Lecompton legislature decided to meet and govern anyway. That's the 37. The 37 elected representatives that were elected by Missouri decided to call themselves the Lecompton legislature. And that's a city in Kansas, Lecompton. So they meet anyway and begin to call themselves the government of Kansas, okay? So in Lecompton, you have a group of people calling themselves the government of Kansas that is all pro-slavery. In Topeka, you have a group of people that is meeting and calling themselves the government of Kansas that is all anti-slavery. In Leavenworth, you have a group of people that is so anti-slavery and also, by the way, universal male suffrage, meaning that they want the Kansas Constitution to allow everyone to vote regardless of their race, all men to vote regardless of their race. And in Wyandotte, you have a group of people that are meeting and drafting a constitution who are anti-slavery but also want, you know, to make peace. That's the constitution they actually end up with, okay? Which is weird because the Lecompton Constitution, the Lecompton legislature had President Pierce's support, even though they were almost universally elected by people from Missouri. President Pierce supported them. Probably he was scared of them. Anyway, so after a state creates a constitution and it gets voted on, it gets submitted to the federal government as a whole, who then sort of checks it for constitutional violations and then votes to approve it and accept it as part of them becoming a state. So as soon as these four completely different groups can get together and find one constitution to submit to the government, then they can become a state. Up until then, they can't be. So President Pierce supports the Lecompton Constitution and holds a vote and orders a vote. For the first vote, Free Soilers boycott the election, so 6,000 to 569 against. Never boycott an election because you don't like the options. I don't know why people think this is going to work. I don't like either one of them, so I'm just going to boycott, and then you're mad about the results. Never boycott an election for that reason. So after they do a second vote, after they've done a full investigation, federal investigation into the voter fraud, they rerun the vote, and Kansas residents overwhelmingly vote against this pro-slavery constitution. Overwhelmingly, 10,000 to 138. Okay, so
This is what it looked like when they boycotted and they knew that it wasn't going to be legit. This is what it looked like when they actually showed up to vote. So under the rules of popular sovereignty, what should happen now?
Technically, I should be anti-slavery.
Kansas should be a free soil state. They voted, the people spoke, that's exactly what they wanted. Here's what actually happened. Okay. Because the Lecompton legislature, because the Lecompton legislature included appointing a governor who was pro-slavery. And when that gets thrown out, the governorship of Kansas will go to somebody that was chosen by that 10,000 other people. Yeah, they set up their capital in Lawrence, which then gets overrun by border ruffians who basically set fire to buildings and stuff. They make it sound like a really big deal. And I guess it's not that it's not a big deal, but let me get the numbers for exactly what happens here. Okay, I'm looking at my notes. Hold on 1 second. A pro-slavery man shoots a free soiler in the back 9 times. They were next door neighbors and they weren't actually arguing about slavery at all. They were arguing about which one of them owned a piece of land that was right in between them. But the sheriff didn't arrest the shooter. He arrested the partner, the business partner of the victim, and threw him in jail. So free soilers, enraged, stormed the jail and arrested the person and rescued the person that had been arrested. And so the sheriff called for a militia to form. Okay, that militia largely came from Missouri. Okay, so do y'all remember when we were talking like a million years ago about what started the actual Boston Massacre? And how it didn't actually have anything to do with British troops and colonists. It had to do with somebody who hadn't paid their bill to a wig maker. This is a very similar situation. These guys were next door neighbors, and for the most part, they were acquaintances. They were arguing over land. They got into a fight in which the pro-slavery man shot the free soiler, and the sheriff, who was pro-slavery, arrested the free soiler's partner instead of arresting the pro-slavery shooter. And then free soilers rose up and rescued the arrested man, and then the sheriff called for a militia to be formed. This is the Wakarusa War, okay? The militia that formed then rode into Lawrence. They rode into Lawrence and burned down a hotel. They destroyed 2 newspaper companies that had free soil newspapers. And then they burned down the home of the leader of that free soil legislature, whose name was Charles Robinson. So he formed his own militia. Okay, have I got this someplace? No, I don't. Okay, he formed his own militia that had 800 men in it, one of whom was John Brown. Do y'all remember talking about John Brown at all last week? He was the anti-slavery guy who said, basically, I will dedicate my whole life to the eradication of slavery, and drooled a little bit the whole time he was doing it because he's a little crazy. We're going to talk about him more. We're not done with John Brown yet. But part of the militia, the free soil militia that gets raised up, is includes him and his sons, which is kind of substantial because that's going to get ugly fast. So the War of Wakarusa and the sacking of Lawrence resulted in exactly 1 death. 1 building burned down. Okay, so this is bleeding Kansas. This is what that looked like. Violence in the streets and all of that kind of stuff. What it actually looks like is, anyway. Well, again, it's like the Boston Massacre. Of course, it sounds bloody when you call it bleeding Kansas. We're not talking about mass murders here. We're talking about riots in which people fight constantly because they're border ruffians and stuff. Okay, hold on. I've got a question in the chat. Oh, okay. It's Jordan. Never mind. It has to do with vampires. I'm not going to bring it up. Okay, so that's what's happening in Kansas. What's happening in Washington is that legislators are actually picking fights with each other on the floor of Congress. And this is kind of a famous moment here.
I would watch this if this happened nowadays.
Yeah, well, it would be so much more exciting. Yes. Okay, so basically, Charles Sumner, who's an abolitionist, got up and gave a speech and said that when the Missouri border ruffians came into Kansas, that was incredibly, it was an invasion. It was, Sumner said that the attitudes of, and he specifically referred to South Carolina Representative Andrew Butler, who was basically saying, go border ruffians, go. Sumner said that his attitude towards Kansas was like raping a virgin. And he said that on the Senate floor. And Andrew Butler was not happy about it. Butler didn't do anything about it, but his cousin showed up the next day, came into the house and nearly beat Charles Sumner to death with his cane. Okay, what's interesting about that is that after that, there were people that sent Preston Brooks, the cousin, new canes or broken shards of canes around their necks. Or they sent letters to him with these canes that said, hit him again. Okay, so free soiler abolitionist Charles Sumner almost got beat to death on the Senate floor by a cane, and the pro-slavery forces' response to that was to wear pieces of the cane around their necks on necklaces and to send him new canes and say, hit him again. This is how vitriolic things have gotten in Congress. So these are the people, I mean, we're talking about we're now in 1854, 1855. Anybody know when the Civil War starts? 1861. We are really close. And you can already see how vicious this situation has gotten. Okay, so John Brown, let's talk for just a second about John Brown. John Brown did not feel like the sacking of Lawrence actually went anywhere as a militia that formed and didn't do anything, only, you know, the Wakarusa War and the one person that was killed, and it had nothing to do with that. It was just a piece of a building fell on him and he died, basically. John Brown felt like enough action was not being taken. So John Brown came into Kansas with his sons and several volunteers and began to go around dragging pro-slavery people out of their houses and putting them on instant trial in their front yards. He and his men dragged 5 pro-slavery advocates out of their houses and killed them, some of them with a broadsword.
So they hacked them to death.
He hacked them to death, yes. I don't know if you've ever tried to wield a broadsword, but it's not really so much of a stabby thing as it is a hacking thing. He beheaded a couple of them. This is the person that, this is the person that believes that his, and let me make sure I've got that right. Let me make sure I've got that right.
I don't know if you noticed, but every now and then you're been on Zoom or go out to the
Yeah, because I'm navigating into my notes, which is on a different file. So I'm kicking you out of the thing, the big slide on Zoom, so that I can look at something in my notes. I usually have them printed out here, but the printer room was locked. So it's Monday for me too.
I wasn't sure if you had or not. So
Okay, so let's go over the whole arc of what just happened. Okay. Kansas was supposed to vote itself on whether or not to be a free state or a slave state. Every time they tried to vote, Missouri border ruffians came in from one end and voted illegally, and Jayhawkers swooped in and packed the population to vote the other way. Okay, and the end result of that is, even though they did take the vote, even though they did have an anti-slavery majority, the Constitution that gets approved, that gets sent to Congress, is the illegal, mostly voted for Missouri, Lecompton Constitution. Okay, so John Brown begins to believe, now he is one of those emigration aid people from New England. He actually came in under that plan. So he didn't live down in Kansas before this started. He moved there to be a part of this conflict. He moved himself and his sons, and we'll talk about that more on Wednesday. But he believes that no amount of voting or due process is going to stop slavery from spreading into the new states. So he carries out these kinds of terroristic actions. He carries out vigilante justice instead. So my question for you is, okay, this is the death toll that we're working with now. 2 people were killed in the sacking of Kansas. 56 deaths have been attributed to local violence during the times of the Kansas elections. So, and then because of all the rushing settlers, there was massive deaths among the Native Americans who were living in the Kansas territory, who were pushed out really, really fast. So the highest death toll all in one instance was John Brown's massacre at Pottawatomie Creek.
He was trying people for their crimes against slaves and for their crimes against the free soilers, and basically handing out justice in the front yards with his broadsword. So, were his actions justice, or was it just vengeful violence? What do y'all think? Okay, what should he have done?
Technically, you should have done it legally, but it's still not gonna go through.
Okay, so he watched the whole process unfold, the legal process of making Kansas a free soil state. He watched as they overwhelmingly voted against making it a slave state, and it's still going to be one. That's how it appears, is that it's still going to be one.
He got back in the corner.
So at what point do these kinds of criminal actions stop being vengeance and start just being justice? What do y'all think?
I mean, murder is still murder.
Yeah, I can definitely agree with that. I mean, he dragged him out of their house and killed him with a sword. So it's not a lot of due process in there.
I get fighting for what you believe in and against a corrupt government that's, you know, manipulating the system and stuff like that. That's been seen many times, but murder's still murder.
Right. And if I told you that John Brown was willing to be tried and executed for these murders, but still felt that like carrying them out was still a worthy thing to do.
I mean, sure, you say, I accept the consequences of my actions, but I'm still going to kill people.
Right, essentially. And that is what he said. He said that that was what all really, really strong abolitionists needed to do, was break the law, which, like, Harriet Tubman is breaking the law by setting slaves free. And he believes that this is just a part of that process. It is against the law to steal slaves from plantations and lead them up north. But breaking the law is the only alternative when the law is already bad. Holding them as slaves is also bad. So that's a law that deserves to be broken. These people are never going to face justice for being pro-slavery people. So, you know, he feels like it's an extension of that same, you have to break this law because it's a bad law, to try them and execute them before they can do more harm. If Harriet Tubman had ridden into the plantations and set people free and also killed the plantation owners in their beds, would we feel differently about Harriet Tubman? She was breaking the law either way. She was just, you know, these were bad laws. Okay, you don't have an assignment for tonight, but you do have a document that I want you to take a look at sometime before Friday, but I want you to have the context for it, so it's okay if you don't look at it today. It's the first inaugural speech of President Abraham Lincoln. And you don't have to talk, we don't have to read it yet because we've got all kinds of context that we want to lay down before we do that, and we're going to lay down most of that context on Wednesday. So, y'all have any questions? Is there anything else I can walk you through or talk you through? Yes.